Morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I especially want to recognize the students that are joining us today because this is a program and a project that is especially important to us. It's literally in our backyard. It's critical for the connection between Chicago and Evanston, as well as for many, many hundreds of thousands of people who ride the system. I also want to thank Chris and Graham. You've kind of become our annual presenters at this time, and the reason why we pick October is that we find that this is the time when most students have the time and want to listen to a program. And as we are a part of the engineering school at Northwestern, it's important to us from that perspective as well. Just a little bit of history, and I may be stepping on Graham's toes, but the structure that exists now was built in the 19-teens. It certainly has served well for over almost 110 years, 105, 110 years. And with that, Graham, I'll turn it over to you, and we will sit back. And Chris, especially thanks for taking time out of your schedule to make this presentation.
Thanks, Norm. I mean, I can yield to Chris for a quick introduction before I step in.
Yeah, I just also want to thank everyone for coming today. This is an exciting project, and for the students in the audience that haven't heard the origin story of the project before, this project really started as a series of conversations between both the community that the northern part of the Red Line serves, as well as the leaders in the city, eventually the state, and the U.S. federal government. So it really was a project that started in Chicago and is now in a very excited, we're very excited to be bringing it, the presentation to you and the project to see it in implementation. But it is kind of an example of, the possibilities of dreaming big. So I want to kind of get that out there for the students that, you see stuff today out there that you think needs to be fixed. You have ideas on how to fix it. Certainly let those ideas become more sophisticated as you go to school, but don't let go of them. An idea that starts as a conversation can ultimately turn into a $2.1 billion project. So with that, I'll turn it over to Graham for the first few slides.
Thanks, Chris. So just very quickly, I'm Graham Garfield. I'm the general manager of operations and communications coordination for RPM. Bit of a mouthful. It basically means that my role primarily is to be a liaison and a conduit between the project and our operations group, bus and rail, service planning, communications functions, primarily customer information types of things, notifying riders about service impacts and changes, signage, things of that nature. And there's a few other things I deal with as well. But joining me is Chris Buchel, the Chief RPM Officer. He's the head honcho for the project. And Chris brings a wealth, decades of experience in building, design, and construction to the project. So we're really pleased to join you today and to bring you this update to the presentation we did about a year ago. There we go. So even though we covered a lot of this last year, of course, I know there's some participants who maybe weren't with us last year, so we'll do a little bit of background and table setting just for anyone new joining us to give you a little context and background. And then we'll dive into some of the really exciting, progress we've made, construction updates, some great photos, and we'll talk about some of the challenges that the project has as well. It's a big project, it's massive in scale, and so, challenges are part and parcel of an effort like that. But just to back up a little bit to give you a little bit of background. So this project is actually RPM phase 1. So RPM as a whole covers the whole north portion of the Red Line from Belmont, which is on the north side where the red and brown lines split from one another. There's a junction there called Clark Junction, all the way up to the north city limits at Howard. And then beyond that, on the purple line, or what's sometimes known as the Evanston branch, all the way up to Linden, which is actually in suburban Wilmette. So it's a very long corridor, and it can't all be tackled at once. So it's being tackled in phases. And what we're working on right now is phase 1. The areas that cover phase 1 are primarily the area around Belmont and Clark Junction, as I mentioned, what we call the RPB area, which stands for Red Purple Bypass. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And then a little further north between Lawrence and a little north of Bryn Mawr, about 1.5 miles of line, and then some signal improvements along a longer stretch. And why did we choose these 2 sections out of that whole corridor? Well, the reason is that they would bring the maximum benefits to the most number of customers. Primarily for 2 reasons. One is that aforementioned junction, which we'll talk about. And so by providing some infrastructure improvements there, we can increase capacity, decrease delays, and that provides additional throughput and other benefits that benefit not only people locally, but all the customers passing through. And then in general, these are all areas a little closer into downtown. So, with still, although there's obviously, especially with the pandemic, been some changes in the nature and patterns of commuting and transit usage, CBD bound trips are still, very heavy. And so this helps reach more customers closer to the max load point. So more customers and passengers passing through these areas will see benefits in addition to the local residents and passengers near these stations. So the 3 parts of phase 1, as I mentioned, one is the Red Purple Bypass, which is basically grade separating Clark Junction. It's building what we call the bypass, which is a flyover track that allows northbound Brown Line trains to exit the main line and access the Brown Line branch without crossing the other tracks at grade. That current setup requires trains to stop and wait because of conflicting train movements, and reducing that bottleneck increases speeds, reliability, and capacity. The second area, as I mentioned, is a little further north between Lawrence and Bryn Mawr on the north side of the city. And this is the reconstruction of 6 miles of track structure and 4 red line stations, making them ADA accessible, as well as simply bringing them up to modern standards, having larger, better lit, more secure facilities with modern amenities. Finally, we're doing signal improvements all the way from Belmont to Howard at the end of the red line. And even though a lot of that area won't get rebuilt in terms of track and structure, by bringing what is currently a 1970s era cab signal system up to current standards will also not only increase throughput, but also simply improves reliability, given that a lot of the parts and infrastructure are becoming difficult to maintain and replace. So what are the benefits? The benefits extend not only to our passengers, but to the communities. For those of you not familiar with this part of the red line, it passes through very densely populated neighborhoods. These are primarily neighborhoods of apartment blocks. There's retail, a lot of mixed use. It's very high density. So our neighbors are right next to us. And so we're bringing benefits to them through improved infrastructure as well as to our riders. So I've mentioned a few of them already. They include faster and smoother rides through the provision of new tracks, bridges, viaducts, and the aforementioned signal upgrades, which will not only allow faster rides, but also quieter ones. By increasing, upgrading the signals and improving the track and structure, it allows us to provide more frequent service, and which reduces crowding. And I mentioned the 4 new red line stations that will be fully modern facilities and have ADA accessibility so that we can have mainline transit access to more of our constituency. It also provides economic growth. There's economic, benefit to these stations, of course, just for the local communities, but we wanted this project to go farther than that. And so we've developed programs for workforce development as well as a high level of SBE and DBE participation. And finally, we also have transit-oriented development planned post-construction for lots that we needed to buy and to clear for construction staging and operations, but will not be needed once the project is completed. So just a quick rundown of some key dates. This project has actually been going on for quite some time. We're really now kind of in the very heavy civil construction phase of it, when a lot of it is very visible. There's things that, you know, on the street you can actually see taking form. But we've actually been laying the groundwork for this for quite some time. As far back as 2018, we began a 3-year period of what we called advanced utility relocation, working with a lot of local utilities, both public and private, to relocate some of that infrastructure within the footprint of the project, so that when we begin excavating and moving things around, we would not provide or create any interruptions to those utility services. We had a project groundbreaking in 2019 for the bypass. From 2020 to 2021, ending just this past May, is a phase we call pre-stage. So for both the LBMM, which is the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr area, and the RPB area, the bypass, there's a lot of work we needed to do before we could even begin the main work, preparatory work, and some more modest upgrades and improvements. But this was especially significant up north in the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr area, where we had to install 2 brand new interlockings at each end of the corridor to allow us to merge and sort trains from 4 tracks to 2 tracks through the construction area, as well as build some temporary stations and some other pre-stage support work as well. But we're now into heavy civil construction in both of those areas, and the bypass is almost ready to be completed. And we're going to show you some pictures of that, and Chris is going to speak to some of the exciting progress in that area. Construction of all 3 areas, the LBMM, the bypass area, and the signal system, is going to continue into 2025. So what are some of the challenges that we face? Well, one of the biggest is simply that we're dealing with a century-old structural system, the existing elevated structure, and a signal system that itself is getting a little long in the tooth. The oldest parts of it are now 50 years old, and as I mentioned, they're becoming difficult to maintain and keep in a good state of repair. But part of what's challenging about that is not only simply that they exist and they're hard to work with in and of themselves, but because the project has to be built in phases and there's a lot of staging, in a lot of cases, you're having to, on a temporary basis, have some new components interface with some of these 100-year-old structural systems or 50-year-old signal systems. And that's a challenge as well, getting those 2 eras of technology to talk to each other, even if it's only on a temporary basis during construction. As I mentioned, all these project areas are in densely populated urban environments. This makes a number of things difficult. One is just moving around. You know, being able to perform basic construction functions is a challenge. You know, when you've got buildings and neighbors, you know, a few feet away from your project footprint. But it also creates challenges for staging materials, for assembling some things off-site, for moving equipment around. It requires a lot of very careful coordination with the community to minimize our impacts to them. Another real challenge is maintaining rail service during this construction period. And, you know, as noted here, it's a very long construction period. But other than some weekends and short durations, the service continues largely, maybe I can't say totally, but largely unimpeded. And that's a challenge, you know, not only keeping the requisite tracks and support infrastructure like signals and certain stations in service, but of course, you're sometimes having to perform construction activities very close to moving trains and passengers. And that, as you can imagine, also requires very careful coordination. As I mentioned, we've set a very high DBE and workforce participation goals for this project, and that requires very close coordination and planning. And finally, those transit-oriented development opportunities post-project are also going to involve a lot of very close coordination, not only with city agencies like Department of Planning and Economic Development, but local elected officials like aldermen and state reps and so forth, and local community groups as well, to make sure that what we do with these parcels is not only brings benefit, but is also in keeping with how the community envisions development occurring in their local area. So the last area that I'll touch on before I hand it over to Chris to get into some of the really fun, exciting construction updates is the idea of coordinating with our transit operations. It's a big part of the project. It's a big part of my job. And so, you know, we have very close coordination with both our service planning group and our transit operation groups, which, as I mentioned, is primarily rail operations, but there's bus impacts as well. And we work very closely with our bus partners as well. And so, you know, the key here is to, you know, have a working relationship with them that allows construction to work around transit service and to sort of balance the two needs. You know, I wish we could do this without any impacts on operations, but that's really not practical. At the same level, though, we need to be very cognizant of not overly impacting operations, to keep those impacts to a minimum, or, you know, to schedule them or plan them in a way, you know, that helps, you know, mitigate at least as much of the impact as we can. And there's a couple ways in which we do that. And one of the biggest is that there is built into the contract with the primary contractor a total quantity and types of different service impacts that they can have to complete the activities for the project. And these were developed in the early planning stages of the project before the contract was let, when our construction and infrastructure group work closely with service planning and operations to go over every step of the project, each phase, and the construction activities involved in those phases, and how they could be done around operations, either keeping operations going normally, or what type of service impact would be needed to accommodate them. And so there's a whole series of planned impacts for basically, you know, a 5-year period for every activity. Now, do we ever deviate from them? You bet we do. But, you know, they were very carefully thought through. Most of them are adhered to. And even when we do need to deviate, the fact that there were already discussions and a plan provides a baseline for those conversations. So we're never starting from zero. It's always based on an existing plan, and, you know, it's understood, not always liked, but understood by our internal clients that sometimes in the course of construction, you know, we may find a condition that was not taken into account in those plans. Sometimes a third party, you know, can throw a wrench in the gears. You know, maybe there's a request by a local elected official for a particular mitigation that wasn't originally envisioned. Any number of things that can cause us to revisit those plans. But by having that plan in place, it provides a baseline for those conversations to occur and allows them to be more productive. Finally, we have weekly and semi-weekly meetings with both planning and operations to keep them updated, to keep lines of communication open, and to make sure they're aware and reminded of upcoming work and facilitating coordination. So we're going to come back to an example of one of these kind of operations phasing plans to accommodate a particular piece of construction a little bit later. So I wanted to just sort of set the table for that. But now I'd like to turn it over to Chris to look at some of the really exciting work we've been doing.
Thank you, Brett. So I want to underline a couple of things here with regard to Graham's participation in this project. He's very modest when he describes his role. we have integrated him into, given the length of this project, given the complicated nature of it, given some of the various challenges. I mean, one of the challenges we're facing is having the right number of people staffed on the project, both from a CTA and consultant perspective, as well as a contractor's perspective. I mean, labor is tight everywhere. We've all read this in the paper, but particularly on large projects, even historically before the current labor shortage. So Graham has become a very integral part of our project team, both from the perspective of communications, because we do need to turn on a dime occasionally and understand exactly how to communicate. I certainly can take care of our front office and talk with them. Although, it is a bigger challenge, I think, for us to get a message out to our customers, get penetration of that message and an understanding of it so that people aren't confused by some of the construction that goes on. And also, as Graham will show you in some of the subsequent slides, the installation of various pieces of infrastructure, particularly as we're connecting things, the bypass would be a great example, and then moving to the next phasing, it becomes very complex. Some of you out there, I went through the participant list, and there's a couple folks on this call who probably have forgotten more about this than I'll ever know. But some of the complexities of the various reroutes, track closures, line cuts, in particular, is blindingly complicated. And so Graham has become an integral part of our team in terms of, being a sounding board for some of the modifications that we've taken place, some of the proposals that have come from the contractor, which, in some cases at first blush, we may not consider, but as we look at deeper and sort of translate it into CTA, if you will, it becomes a good idea that we end up implementing, and Graham is key to that. So it's not, Graham doesn't just coordinate between construction and the contractor. He's also a generator of those ideas. And I think in that regard, Graham, you are an integral part of the team. And I honestly, at this point, can't imagine building the project without you.
Thank you.
So as we get to 2 years on here, 2 years a little bit plus, we're putting our first big piece of infrastructure in place quickly, and we'll be running trains on the bypass certainly within the next few weeks. We are nearing completion of the rail bypass that will carry the Kimball-bound Brown Line trains and eliminate a bottleneck caused by this 114-year-old rail junction. For those of you that are students, getting rid of a rail junction in a place with dense service is like getting rid of stoplights on a highway. I mean, we don't see stoplights on the Dan Ryan. And if you put one on, you back traffic up to in the north to Wisconsin and the south to Indiana. So, putting in bypasses like these, we get a lot of additional throughput capacity. It's a big deal. I love a flat junction, but it's not ideal for moving one of our busiest lines, nor one of our lines that's growing the fastest. Rebuilding the red and purple lines underneath the bypass between Belmont and Cornelia to straighten the curve and increase train speeds. That's really the next phase that comes as we complete this bypass. So, two important things on this first milestone. One is using the bypass and then progressing beyond it. It's sort of we call it the bridge over, and then there's the bridge under. And we'll be able to start that as soon as we get the bypass, as soon as we get the bypass operational. So next slide. So the bypass, as you know, will carry Kimball bound Brown Line trains over the red and purple tracks. You can see on the right, the installation of a noise wall on the new bypass. I will say, we took some time with this bypass, not only refining the engineering of it, although for the most part, the contractor is really building the base case design, if you will. But we did take some time to refine that design, particularly in ways that we're customer facing. The basics of the bypass were really in place in the design that CTA worked out ahead of time. The contractor knew they had to get on the ground and execute that design very quickly, so they made minimal changes to it. But the development of the aesthetic package was pretty important. This is a neighborhood that is very close to existing residential and business. You can see in places the bypass is only inches away from adjacent structures. But more importantly, we're at cross streets. We wanted to create rooms there that were not, were as pleasing as it could be being under a rail bridge. We wanted columns that reflected an overall design. They were pretty bulky columns. We wanted to bring in some aesthetics that would break them up visually a little bit. We are doing a lot of lighting underneath the viaducts. It's not just for security. It also creates a pleasing visual at nighttime. So you are both secure, you can see through it, yet there's also sort of a visual interest there. Again, trying to soften this infrastructure and integrate it into the community in thoughtful ways. And I'll add slightly different ways, whether if the bypass is crossing a residential street or if it's crossing a main business street like Clark. So we tried to put in mind, we tried to keep in mind as we were designing it that we were creating these rooms, and would the rooms be, post-industrial, ugly with just security lighting, or would they be rooms that reinforce the aspirations of the community? I mean, there's a limited ability to be able to do this, given the constraints of the project. But I hope once you see this take its final form, you'll see some of that endeavor to soften the edges and to integrate a big piece of infrastructure into the community. Next slide. So in the coming weeks here, I can walk through. We are attaching the bypass to the Brown Line Kimball tracks. We've done that already, actually. We have installed the interlocking to the north. At Kenmore, there's actually another part of that interlocking that gets installed after the bypass is in service, but the main turnout that connects the bypass to the Brown Line tracks was installed the weekend before last. That was a good operation, went smoothly, on time, no major issues, minimal impact. We did do it during a line cut, as one would expect. It went well. We were pleased. It was the contractor is performing this work with in-house labor. So we were a little conservative on what we kind of let them bite off, but they did very well. They brought on, as you would expect, tried and true folks who had done this before, but as a team, it was their first time up on the elevated. Now we had a second weekend where we kind of came in, did a line cut this past weekend. That went successfully, but there wasn't a huge amount of work because they had finished all of it on the first weekend. So really there was a lot of cleanup and various pieces of structural work to support the new signal system. Some of you will appreciate the interference or the details associated with putting signal platforms in and other various sorts of platforms to support some of the jewelry in and around the track system. And then right afterwards on Monday morning, we went right into the to the slide in, which is connecting the bypass on the railroad south end of it, near the Belmont station. That is a section of bridge that was built off to the side. And we'll use small hydraulic pieces of equipment, whether or not that small, self-propelled, if I can get this right, SPMT, self-propelled something transit. Probably somebody put it in the chat. There's at least a handful of people that probably know that better than I am. But regardless, we built it off to the side. We are in the process of doing demolition of the existing tracks at the Belmont Station, track 4. This is the track that's furthest to the east. Once that demolition is complete, the Mammoth SPMTs will move the bridge in place. That operation takes place over 12 days. And as I said before, it started on Monday, actually 14 days. Started on Monday, will end on a Saturday night. So if you're in the area, you want to see it happen, it's pretty exciting. We will be moving it over towards the end of this coming week. So, and undoubtedly there'll be stuff on social media or other places seeing that moving in place. So yeah, next slide. North attachment, you got the Kenmore Interlocking up there, and then the bypass facing east. These are some of the first images for those of you who are interested from our new CTA cameras up there. So, exciting pictures of both pieces of infrastructure up there. So next. So the slide in, you can kind of see how it was constructed off to the side. None of the this picture is got none of the Mammoth or the SPMTs up there yet. Some of them are now in place for the eventual slide in. We have started a reroute to get trains off of that track 4 and have started the demolition. Demolition's going well, although it's demolition, it's going to be loud. There's going to be dust. We've taken a lot of time to make sure the community is aware. Helpfully, we have a senator that lives across the street, so we'll be working, to make sure that she understands what that noise is and can help us disseminate the message to the community as well. But you kind of get a picture from this, you get a view rather from this slide of how this would eventually work. So as you can see, the track 4, the farthest one to the east, gets demolished, and then this whole other piece gets slid in, connecting the bypass then on the railroad south end, right by the Belmont station. I will also add, one of the really nice things here, once this goes in place, is we eliminate a little curve out of the station that's kind of a headache for maintenance. So it is a curve that where the track tends to wear a little unevenly, given the nature of the curve. The curve we're putting in there is a little bit better. The geometry is an improvement. So that's a good thing for the consistency of rail service through this area, or at least the quality of it, and the ease of track maintenance going forward. Next. So we're kind of getting into the next section. So the bypass work here continues. We put the bridge over in place, the bypass, and then we start to work on the bridge under. And this is a key aspect of the project because, as many of you can appreciate, the speeds leaving Belmont are relatively slow because of a series of small curves. Many of them date back to the original construction of the CTA predecessors, because back then people that were developing this were private developers. They couldn't really condemn property. They had to work within the property that they could acquire. So the tracks sort of snaked through, not huge curves, but curves in the railroading sense that were enough to make us slow down the trains through this area and ultimately have a significant effect overall on throughput. So straightening those curves, getting a better geometry through that area and raising speeds, again, becomes kind of a critical part of a project that builds capacity on one of our busiest lines. So you can kind of see on the left, the red and purple line structure north of Belmont contains an S-curve that slows traffic, contributes to delays, adds maintenance costs in an area that's pretty difficult to get crews up there to do, day-to-day type of maintenance. And then on the right, the new track, which again, just kind of looks like new track, but in straightening this out, and we went to great lengths to it. We took some properties in this area. In one case, we couldn't demolish a building, so we actually had to move it. It was a historic building. So it is a big part of this bypass, and really probably harder in many senses than doing the bypass itself. So when we rebuild these tracks in this area, we're not going to rebuild all of them at once under a line cut, as most of you would expect. We'll put all of our traffic, all the train traffic, onto two tracks north of Belmont effectively, and then we'll reconstruct 2 of them. So and then we get the 2 of them done. We'll flip that over and start again. Next, Graham, I don't know, where's our jump here? How many slides do we have until that? There's
this one, and then a few pictures of the RVT, and then I jump in with the phasing for RVT.
All right, great. So the path to the North Main reconstruction, we will start in November here with Micropile, shoring towers, cut and throw installations. Graham will talk a little bit about some of the ways we're going to do those cut and throws. Those of you that are familiar with this project may recognize some possibilities or things we've talked about in greater detail in those cut and throw diagrams. We complete the bypass. So the bypass is effectively completed, but there are some various things that need to be done to get the full functionality of it. Going into December of 2021, we'll start the North Main tracks 1 and 2 demo and micropile work. Kenmore Interlocking round 2. There's another turnout that's required to get the full interlocking up there. And then of course the relay house installation. This will be our first digital track circuit house, I believe, and we're excited to see that. The contractor Hitachi is just completing their overall design effort as they're manufacturing the first houses for the DG circuit. We are at the CTA, and I think some folks out there will appreciate this. Certainly Mr. Zika, Mr. Keevel. we're kind of suckers for pain a little bit of the CTA. We installed not just one signal system on this project, but two. We installed a temporary signal system in one area. That's the pre-stage work that Graham talked about, really a pretty standard modern signaling system. And then we are now installing a digital track system, which gives us much of the advantage of say, a more sophisticated system like a CBTC once we come back later and install digital control packages on our various rail cars. So it is an interesting experiment here and enables us to get some of the benefits of CBTC or more incremental control of the trains without going through the type of retrofit that would be needed to do that, which would probably be something that at this point in CTA's history may be cost prohibitive unless we did it sort of incrementally by line. Next slide. Temporary track construction. So in order to get to the point where we can do tracks 1 and 2, we have to actually install a temporary bridge in this area. Temporary. That has a different meaning for us at CTA than it does anywhere else. It basically means we don't use it for that long, but it doesn't ever look like temporary because, you know, there is no real temporary in railroading as a general rule. It's got to be built to the standards that we can run on it. So it almost always has to be built to the standards of permanent construction. But, and this has been, you know, many of the pieces of track work here, the older style pieces of track work where we're connecting new infrastructure to old ones have ended up being the trickiest part of this job. Just the basic stuff's getting elevations right, getting the details of the tie layouts right. You know, it is the segmented box girder, you know, once we're up and running will be a beautiful thing. It's a pretty smooth operation, but getting to it and getting to the places where we're both interfacing with the community as well as a 100-year-old track system has been some of the major challenges we've had in this project as a whole. Not unexpectedly, really. And you know, those are the points where we as CTA employees who understand and can bring the resources and the historical knowledge of this infrastructure to the table. That's really one of our highest and best uses, not to necessarily know what the most efficient and modern construction methods are. We're not very familiar, for example, as an organization with segmented box girders, but we have a long history with open deck track. So, but these are some of the hardest things we're doing is these connection points. Next. All right, I'll turn it back over to Graham.
So I thought that this would be a good example. The RVT track, what we call RVT, Ravenswood Temporary, is what that stands for. Track, putting it in service would be a good example to illustrate some of the operations phasing that we have to do. So as Chris mentioned, in the area here around Clark Junction, as we are up north, we're reconstructing the 4-track main line 2 tracks at a time. So we have 2 tracks out of service and then all other trains on the remaining 2 tracks through the construction area. In the RPB area, the bypass area, the red and purple line trains, which continue north from here to Howard and the city limits, and then the purples continue beyond that, they get put onto 2 tracks through what Chris mentioned are what we call cut and throws. Basically temporary track connections where over a weekend or a similarly short period, we sever 2 parallel tracks and put in a temporary connection between them to make a connection. And so you can see on this diagram, the red and purple line trains on either side of the 2-track corridor kind of make these sharp turns, right? And obviously this is a diagram. The actual curves are more gentle than this. But those represent cut and throws that were put in to move them from the middle tracks to those 2 east tracks towards the bottom of the diagram. But what I'm going to talk about is how to get the brown line trains off the other 2 tracks. Now, for the northbound trains towards Kimball, they use the bypass. And so that's how they vacate the 4-track main line, a little bit of it that it runs on beyond Belmont Station to allow for the reconstruction. But the southbound trains going towards the loop run on the 4-track main line for a very short duration. It's about a block and a half from where the branch track merges into the main line and then gets to Belmont Station. But nevertheless, that one block has to be reconstructed, the structure and the track. So that's why the Ravenswood temporary track is built, as you saw on the previous slide, to sort of just vacate that one block of track. We had to build this structure here over the adjacent alley. And so you can see the new track obviously is the gray structure and the existing structure is the sort of rusty beige. But the amount of gymnastics we have to do operationally just to get those southbound trains off the existing track and onto the temporary track, I think is illustrative. So the first step, once the red and the purple line trains are relocated to the 2 eastern tracks, is to create a temporary track connection between the former northbound track and former northbound Brown Line branch track to what we call track 2, which is traditionally a southbound red line track. So it's that dotted area in light blue, and the new track connection is the dashed dark blue line. Now this work can be done without rerouting any trains. So trains will operate, you know, more or less normally while this work occurs kind of in the middle of the junction. Excuse me. But after that occurs, we need to begin tying in the temporary Ravenswood track. So we do it one end at a time, kind of similar to the bypass. But obviously to do that tie-in, the revenue trains, the in-service trains, have to vacate that track that's being severed and reconnected. And so we use that temporary connection we put in the previous phase to take southbound Brown Line trains. So that's the branch that's kind of going up and down on the diagram. The arrows pointing down are inbound trains. Go down, they go through a crossover that was installed as part of a previous phase of work. And then they go on what was previously the northbound track through that new track connection onto track 2 of the main line, and then use an existing crossover to get back to track 1. Phew, that's quite a bit of rerouting to do, just to, you know, basically for a weekend's work to make that connection there. But we now have to connect the other end, which requires vacating, you know, the track 1 nearer to Belmont Station. And to do that, we run a single track, trains sharing the same track in both directions, via the bypass, because there's really just no other way to vacate that track 1 immediately adjacent to Belmont Station. And this is where, you know, planning for some of this permanent infrastructure required taking a more holistic look, because a piece of infrastructure like the bypass needed to function not only for its regular service needs, but also for emergency needs, unplanned, you know, service changes, and then future phasing of the project like this. So that's why it's built with bidirectional signaling, and why some of these crossovers that aren't needed in regular service get installed. It's for construction phasing. So southbound or inbound Brown Line trains use an existing crossover that you can see up there on the branch towards the top of the diagram. And they're going to share the track, obviously alternating, taking turns through a very closely controlled process that operations uses to use the bypass in the reverse direction, or what we call against traffic, all the way to Belmont Station. And then it uses existing crossovers to go back normal. And so you see in the dotted sort of aqua blue corner there where we're putting in the additional track connection. And then when it's all done, they use that Ravenswood temporary track to kind of skirt around the construction zone inbound while using the bypass northbound. And at that point, we're able to fully reconstruct tracks 1 and 2 between Cornelia Avenue, just south of Addison Station, and Belmont. So this is indicative of the type of phasing and careful staging and service impacts that we have to implement to maintain rail service around these rather intricate construction activities. I'll turn it back over to Chris to take a look at the exciting new stations we're going to build up north.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. And those of you that know Graham know his familiarity with the railroad and our ability to work with operations can see why his role is so integral here. You know, many of the steps that we're proposing we did set forth in the original phasing, but some have had some fairly significant modifications. For example, I think the slide in, I think crazily enough, was a weekend piece of work originally. It's probably possible to do the demolition and then slide it in using those self-propelled modular transports, but I don't think it's very practical. And extending that time to 12 to 14 days made a lot of sense, both in terms of getting better testing, better closeout, better safety certifications. And those were the kinds of things that Graham and other folks from planning, we had some folks from the planning department originally on our project who were very integral to some of the environmental work, really worked through a lot of those details. So you can kind of see how, you know, once we get to the point where we're building tracks 1 and 2, there's a certain level of efficiency. Getting through each of those weekends and the planning, that's really where we're kind of the riverboat captains helping the contractor through a pretty complicated part of the river so they can get to more open water and gain some speed. So the stations, most of you have seen pictures of these. We've released them, you know, I think earlier this year, this summer, for the most part, we showed them to the various communities. You know, it is a design build. We do have a good architect that's worked with us on these stations. They have various types of historical references given the Section 106 requirements and some of the historic neighborhoods that they fit into. In other cases, for example, the Berwyn station, you know, has kind of a main customer path, if you will, that comes off of Broadway and has a lot of, I think, bus transfers at this location. So you can kind of see we offset the entrance a little bit to appeal to that. So that's maybe a little bit more of a modern typology to that station, a little more dynamic, whereas in the Bryn Mawr station, for example, in a historic district, lots of terracotta, that design is a little more traditional. We are actually incorporating some of the components of the existing station, those columns you see in the front of it there, into the design of the new station. But these are modern stations. They are accessible. In being accessible, they have better sight lines. I think they're going to feel safer. They're better lit. They're dry. The earlier stations were an integral part of the bridges above them. These are somewhat separate buildings than the other buildings, where you really had. It was very difficult to keep some of the stations dry in this area because really the roof of the station was the bridge above it, and you know, it didn't have a separate roof that we could replace or repair. If you wanted to fix the roof, you had to take the tracks off, which we did about 10 years ago. But nonetheless, the challenges of maintaining these stations were getting to be quite a burden on the CTA, or we weren't able to do it. And our passengers would have stations that had either water coming down into them or not optimal lighting, et cetera, et cetera. So these two stations are pretty indicative of the difference between one that's a little more historic at Bryn Mawr, one that's a little more modern at Berwyn. Next slide. At Argyle, we worked with various, we didn't have a benevolent association up there, but we did have various community associations, including chambers of commerce, that wanted to honor the Asian traditions up there. So we worked with them to incorporate various elements into the design. The pagoda and some of the other things will be relocated in that area. There's a Asia on Argyle sign right to the west of our station, which will be relocated within the community, as well as the pagoda. So we're working with the community on those sculptural community-based elements. I'll also say, you know, kind of talking about, we talked about rooms a little bit on the bypass, how the bypass, as it goes over a street, creates a room that we wanted to make, soften the edges of, so that it wasn't sort of raw major heavy infrastructure in the middle of your neighborhood. Similarly, we realized that the areas under these stations, as you approach the station, is actually the first room of the station, and providing lighting and other architectural features there to welcome you into that room as you then enter the station becomes an element, I think, of good station design. We've seen the manifest improvements of that within the community in stations like Belmont, Fullerton, and other of the Brown Line capacity projects that we've done. Lawrence Station, whoops, well, we can keep going. The Lawrence Station is the last of these. This was probably the most dismal of the 4 stations that we replaced. That was little more than a fence in an area under the room and some fair equipment under the bridge. It had been repaired or worked on variously over years, but it really was a very primitive station. It now becomes a real accessible station with comfortable platforms, good sight lines, lighting, accessibility, etc. Next. So the status of this work, for the most part, I'm going to get to the end here. We had a little incident with a caisson drill rig, but in general, the phases of this work, the demolition, the installation of earth retainage systems between tracks 2 and 3, so that we could run trains on 3 and 4 while we did work on 1 and 2. That ERS system is in at this point. We're installing the last of the tiebacks on it. It's gone quite well. The demolition, I think we took down our last viaduct last week at Argyle. It has progressed generally smoothly, as smooth as this work can go. We had to close streets or close areas for a little bit of time, either on a weekend if it was a major street, or a little bit longer if it was a neighborhood street. But generally speaking, finding the right place to demolish, the right techniques. We do something in the industry called construction process plans. We dip our toes a little bit into the contractor's means and methods, really just to vouchsafe just to make sure that our customers and our employees are safe. We just want a lot of detail about what the contractor is going to do ahead of time, to make sure that there's very little improvisation that occurs on our projects. Those construction process plans are a ton of work for the contractor to work through the details. We ask a lot of questions, but generally speaking, the details were worked out well in advance for this demolition, and it occurred very smoothly. Next. Drilled shaft work. We are using a slightly different type of piece. It's a slightly different caisson rig than we used in the area of RPB. We have an oscillator on this rig. We were using IMT equipment, Italian built equipment, up until recently. We got this is the parts. The parts of have gone well. I think on the Lawrence and Bryn Mawr, the ERS I talked about, putting that earth retainage system between the 2 tracks so we could do work on one side, run on the other. The demolition of the wall, we're doing a lot of different wall demolitions. We're creating ramps so pieces of equipment can go up. And then, as I said, we're demolishing the viaducts. That work has all gone well, on or slightly ahead of schedule. The drill rig, actually, we had some struggles with, the contractor had some struggles with starting off using these rigs. I would expect some of that, as their productivity builds to what it's required to be in the schedule. But this, because of the closeness of these rigs to the buildings, maneuvering them into place was a challenge. Not much in the way of discovered conditions in terms of once we started to drill. Some of the supportive excavation work that was required in some of these areas to support the oscillator or to support the drill rig was a little complicated. That generally, though, went pretty well. It was really just the drilling itself that we had some challenges with. Various technical details about how the equipment attaches to the casings was a little tricky. Once we were really starting to get it down, the contractor was starting to get it down when we had the incidents. You can go to the next slide. And I want to say before I get into this, first of all, I'm going to probably be pretty circumspect here. I think Welsh Ford would probably expect would appreciate me saying less rather than more. But I do want to thank for a moment here. We're talking as though we're doing the work here. I'm not doing the work. I'm managing it. Graham's providing a lot of insight and management on it, as well as a team of CTA and consultants that help us do construction management or owner's representative work. But the real work is being done by Welsh Floor and their designers, Stantec on the heavy civil structural and kind of wraparound side, and Hitachi on the signaling side. And I'll say in particular, you know, the Welsh Floor team has really busted their butts. This is not an easy project. We installed, as you guys saw last year, 2 interlockings over the course of 2020. 2 major interlockings at Montrose and Thorndale, as well as advancing the bypass to the point we're almost ready to run on it. This was not an easy piece of work to do in the best of circumstances. I will say, working during the pandemic when we were all remote and didn't have the ability to see each other every day and to coordinate, that was particularly difficult for the contractor. I think that some of the challenges associated with various crews maintaining social distancing, you know, it is difficult to stay fully masked if you also have protective eyewear on. It is difficult to leave the mask on if you are working in the area of a very heavy piece of equipment that makes a lot of noise. I don't want to underplay the difficulty and challenge for the men and women that built this project, both the labor in the field as well as the management. They are a first-class effort, first-class outfit that has really busted their butts start to finish. This is so not an easy job. And to do it over a pandemic, I mean, they really are frontline heroes, every one of them. And this Lawrence and Bryn Mawr team, being led by a relatively young fella from Welsh Floor, has done an amazing job. So let's go to the incident. I'll be quick about it. I just wanted to thank Welsh Floor. They are really kicking butt, and they're doing a really good job. They're trying really, really hard. So we were drilling a new caisson. The rig became unstable, fell over. Thank God, no one was hurt. No one seriously hurt. Minor injuries to the operator. He was treated and released. The mast of the rig came down just to the side of an existing apartment building, missing it by feet. So it was a serious incident, probably the most serious construction incident I've ever been a part of. Thankfully, there weren't a lot of injuries or fatalities. That said, we're taking it very seriously. We're looking at the root cause. We're looking to see what we can do to improve the safety of the project going forward. What kind of equipment, what kind of loads, and how we can make sure that this type of incident doesn't happen again on this project. But I didn't feel like we could have a presentation on it without at least showing you a slide. And if there's any questions, I may try to be a little general in my answers just because the investigation is still underway, but I'm happy to try to answer any questions we have if we get to that. But it was scary, it was serious, and we keep the safety of our employees, passengers, and the community at first and foremost. We issued a stop work order immediately after this, only lifting it for the rest of the work after we did kind of an overall safety review. And then, you know, we still have a stop work on this pending the completion of the investigation and mitigation going forward. So no caissons are being drilled at the moment. Next. There you go. So the gantry, the loading gantry, the launching gantry rather. This design, this approach, most of you are familiar with it in the industry. Design construction will result in faster construction, fewer impacts. The real benefit to doing this is we get longer spans and we have to do fewer caissons in general. We get basically double the span, and that enables us to cut the number of caissons in general to about a quarter of what we would have needed to have. So where you have 4 in a bent, you probably just need 2, and where they were 50 feet apart, they can now be over 100 feet apart. Additionally, there is the fabrication of these components are mostly done off-site. They're shipped in place. And then they can be installed using this gantry, which installs them in a linear fashion rather than a large crane, which as that crane is swinging a heavy load over a street, over a building, over live trackage, we would have to take various and sundry safety precautions. In this case, we just sort of load the segments up and then put them peer to peer. We pre-tension them, and then we move on to the next, or we post-tension them, and then we move on to the next segment. It's a pretty straightforward process once it gets rolling. It's the hard part about getting the gantry up there, getting it ready to the point where we can construct on tracks 1 and 2 and run on 3 and 4. Those are really the parts that were more challenging. Although this is a big thing. I don't know if we have any pictures of it, as it was just assembled and put up on the piers. There we go. It is about as long as a football field, or I'm told a 747. You can see we not only are using the Mammut equipment. They've been kind of integral in this project. They, as I said before, they're moving the slide in into place. They're using various pieces of their modular equipment to move the gantry in place. The gantry is made by an Italian company. Much of it was built in China at their facility there. Deal is the company that Walsh Fleur is working with to build the gantry and actually to do the geometry control and the forms for the individual segments. But if you get a chance to go up there, this is a huge piece of equipment. We've got it up on piers now, and in the next month, we'll be putting our first segments in place. After we get the first segment in place, you can see a picture of one right here. We will then install another gantry. There is the launching gantry and then the loading gantry. The loading gantry is sort of the little baby brother of the launching gantry that gets installed in the street at Ardmore, and then we have 4 loading places. And as we're done with the segment at Ardmore, with a stretch of it, we'll move it down to another street, and then we'll build it all on the east side, and then we'll bring it back up to Ardmore and do the west. Next.
So we're just going to wrap up just with a quick mention of the workforce goals and efforts that we put forward on this project. If I go through it a little bit quickly, to be clear, it is not due to a lack of importance. This is actually something that we take very seriously. Our president and our chairman also, this is of great importance to them and the city, and we feel that the project can really be beneficial beyond just the infrastructure improvements it provides. So, an important part of this project is to be as inclusive as we can. And this involves maximizing the amount of business opportunities that we can provide to either small business enterprise or SBE, or disadvantaged business enterprise or DBE, individuals, entities, groups to work as subcontractors on the project. So to ensure that the work is spread around, we attached a 20% goal of the project's design work to go to small businesses, as well as separately 20% of the construction work to go to SBE or DBE enterprises. We also placed workforce goals in the contract, and these goals include requiring at least 10% of the labor hours go to individuals who qualify under Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act program, 35% of the labor hours from the lowest income zip codes, and 15% of labor hours from union apprentices. And we are meeting these goals, but we want to do more than just meet them. And that's why we have contracts with 2 leading workforce agencies, Hire 360 and Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership, to find and intake individuals and connect them with training and apprenticeships to not only work on RPM, but to work on other projects beyond, to provide an investment not only for our limited project, but for the future of these individuals and these communities. And that's why we've built the CTA Building Small Business Series, which is a free program that provides technical and financial expertise to small businesses to bid on projects like RPM and be successful. And this is really one of the biggest barriers for small businesses and DBEs to become involved in a project like this, is that there's a lot of paperwork, quite honestly, bureaucracy. Obviously, a program like this has a lot of federal and local requirements that are very hard for a small entity to navigate. And so we support them by providing them training and assistance to do so. So it's just something that we wanted to highlight. It's been very successful, and we continue to sort of reach and broaden that inclusiveness as much as we can.
And Graham, let me just put a cap on that too, to say, when we talked about this project initially, it improves a piece of our infrastructure on the north side of Chicago, a very diverse part of the city, I might add. But regardless, we made it very clear that this was a project for the entire city. And that's true from a transit perspective. We all know as transit fans, if you fix one part of the system, it's going to benefit the whole system. Certainly the red line to the south gets a lot of benefits in terms of throughput here. But we wanted to be more specific and wanted to make sure that economically it was going to benefit the various parts of our community, particularly the south, southwest, and the west sides, areas that are more economically challenged than some areas in the more prosperous north or the northwest. And so while this project is taking place in the north, we've bent over backwards, not only have a robust DB effort, 20% and 20% for design and construction, but also workforce development. We have brought, as there's a labor shortage, we've actually been able to use that to the advantage of incoming apprentices. We've seen a good apprentice workforce on this project and build some of the skills for the next large project, which actually will be on the south side of the red line expansion. So we're going to see a lot of folks who are getting trained as apprentices here, and particularly in the electrical trades, that will go on to six-figure jobs pretty quickly and working on as journeymen on the red line extension project. Big deal. This is a project for the whole city, not just for the whole region, rather, not just for the north side of Chicago. And I think that concludes our effort. I also want to thank, I saw Tammy's on here, Tammy Chase, who helped Graham and I put this presentation together. As always, Tammy, you're the best. Thank you. Also, a shout out to all my old CTA colleagues. I saw a bunch of them on there. I mentioned Glenn and Walter, but I see John Plant and a host of other folks, Ken Davidson from the East Coast. So anyone who's I missed, you guys you're great, and we love working with you, and hope we're keeping up the tradition of good projects for the CTA. Any questions?
Yeah. So. Graham and Chris, thank you very much. That was a very informative presentation about what's taking place right now. Norm, I tried to invite you to unmute, so I hope you can. But what Norm's up to speed is, Norm, is there anything you'd like to say? I've got some questions that I can share from the audience. And
Chris, as you know, I've known Graham for over 20 years, and I think he's an extraordinarily talented person, and I want to thank you very much for that shout out. I really enjoyed hearing that. And Graham, you deserve everything that Chris said.
Well, many of you know that Graham started off actually doing construction stuff, so he's kind of come home a little bit.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's been a great project to work on and continue to work on, and to return, the compliment. Chris has been a great boss to work for, and continue to, this project has provided a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities, and they're both the things that attracted me to it. So, it's been a fantastic opportunity, and it's exciting to see it take form, and that's really a testament to Chris's leadership on the project.
Questions?
Yeah, so let me start, and we probably have about 15 minutes worth of questions. If either of you need to run sooner than that, just send a signal. Let me start with a question from Cal Silverberg. I'm going to modify it slightly. Has any of the construction so far been live streamed? And if not, is there any plan to do it in the future? And he was specifically asking about the slide-ins, or have any slide-ins been live streamed, or any plan to be?
Well, we moved the Vo Travers building. We did post that footage of that on our social media channel. So I would say your best bet is to follow us on social media. That will typically link to various things we'll put up on YouTube. So yeah, you're definitely going to see the slide in. So
we tend to do, as we did with Vo Travers, posting a time lapse after the fact, because the live streaming, it's very slow. Vo Travers moved, I think, what was it, about a foot every couple hours or something like that. It's watching paint dry in real time, but the time lapses are very illustrative, and we've posted some of those, and we'll continue to do so.
As Glenn would probably tell you, the most exciting part is after they've moved it and they're connecting it. the degree to which that goes smoothly is really the key. And then putting track on top of it. So both of those things, but no live streaming, but follow us on social media. Our social media team does a great job of putting stuff out right on time and with good content. So you'll get good stuff there.
Okay, so I'm going to run through the questions. We've got questions coming in, but we are going to wrap at 1:30. So we'll see what we can get to here. And John Plant has sent several questions. I'm going to mix it up a little bit. I will not ask all his in order.
Oh, come on.
But starting with John, you know, John's a friend of the program. We like John. So John's first question is regarding DBE, SBE percentage. He's asking about what is the percentage of these contractors compared to the standard set for qualifying RFPs, you know, whatever the regional standard may be. And I've got a second question from him that I will ask. Let's start with that one.
Well, is there regional standards for $2 billion jobs? I mean, I think the amount of the amount of DBE business on this project is going to go north of $200 million, which is way bigger than most projects as a sum total. I think CTA, if you were to compare the goals that CTA has set and the way we've set them and how we've combined the DBE goals with workforce goals, I honestly don't think you'd see another project in the United States that has as aggressive an equity program as we do. We had a gentleman on earlier who was leading a similarly sized $2 billion project out east, the GLX project. I think he probably had to jump off for another meeting. But I think the goals in Chicago are appropriate to our desire to see equity and fairness in this city. And they're probably higher than similarly sized projects in other jurisdictions.
Thank you. He has another question about safety oversight, and I'm going to read this, and it makes sense to you. He's asking, how is safety oversight being handled? Is it being handled completely with the contractors and contract oversight? Or both with the authority retaining safety oversight? I'm not sure that how typed it translates right. If you can interpret that for me.
Yeah. No, I mean, you know, the contractor has their own safety team. They have their own quality team, but there isn't much at CTA that we don't get into, either through our owner's representative or construction management or our own CTA forces within the project or our own safety projects in the organization as a whole. I mean, there are some aspects of the safety project, say the certifications that we're handling kind of with a dedicated safety professional inside the project with oversight in the safety department. And then there is on the construction site safety, there is the layer of the contractor, the owner's representative, the owner within the project, and then the owner of the safety department as a whole. So what we're obviously trying to do with these multiple layers of oversight is assign specific tasks to each one of them, so that we eliminate the possibility that that each of those oversights reinforces the one under it. So, you know, some of the oversight that our CTA safety department is doing is very specific on construction site safety, and, you know, kind of ties together not just this project, but all of the construction projects at CTA as a whole. And as you kind of get down into the layers under that, the expertise maybe becomes more specific around given tasks. So there is different, the contractor is handling, they have their own safety folks, their own subcontractor safety folks. There's a level of oversight with regard to the construction manager, another one with us, and then kind of an overarching one throughout the CTA. So it's comprehensive, and it's a very focused effort. We miss you, John, but we have tried to honor your spirit and involve everyone in making safety everyone's business, while having specific responsibilities and oversight along the way as well.
Thanks, Chris. Let's go to a question from Adam Kerman, who asks, at stations where the outside tracks will be on structure cantilevered, on the new retaining wall are rails direct fixation or ballasted? Then I have a follow-up.
The whole project's direct fixation, except for a couple of places where we're attaching stuff or transitions between direct fix and open deck.
Will track centers be spread for the possibility of operating wider rail cars as anticipated in the wider track centers of the State Street and Dearborn subways?
No, in general, we're anticipating for future growth in the length of trains. So in general, we're building the infrastructure where we can to accommodate 10 cars. Spending a lot of time on width doesn't make a lot of sense for us unless it's done more systemically because of some of the curves that we have located and the desire to be able to move cars around from route to route. We generally have the capacity within our system to use any car on any route. So that's an important concept. So if we're looking for anything, it's growth in the length of trains rather than the width of them.
Thank you, Chris. 2 questions from Cindy Anderson. I'll ask them one at a time. How, if at all, has reduced ridership due to the pandemic affected the pace of RPM construction activities?
I'm going to stop answering these questions and let Graham answer some, but I'll say this, you know, where the system has been given lemons, we have tried on the project side to make lemonade. For example, rather than doing individual weekend interventions in the installation of the major interlockings pre-stage or ahead of the Lawrence and Bryn Mawr construction, we did more continuous reroutes that enabled greater construction efficiency and less impact to adjacent communities, because when we gave the contractor more time, we also told them they couldn't work 24/7, that they had to create quiet periods on the overnight so that we didn't drive folks nuts that lived, you know, a block or 2 blocks away from the construction site. I mean, we might have done that anyway, but we really tried to minimize the impacts associated with that kind of construction because we had lower ridership and we could have some greater impacts that we wouldn't ordinarily have if we were providing full service.
All right, another.
We're still loud and noisy and work all the time though. We're trying, but it's kind of hard to get out of that.
There we go. I'm unmuted.
It had been muted.
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris, you know, hit it pretty well with that. I mean, it's provided some opportunities, you know, but it's been a double-edged sword, right? Because it's also provided, you know, some challenges with some of our own workforce issues, as Chris mentioned. So, you know, we've taken advantage of it where we could. And in some cases, it did provide benefit not only to the project, but to the community by allowing us to maybe do some work a little bit more aggressively and more quickly, which then, you know, decreased the number of days that an activity might have impacted the community in total otherwise. But, you know, we've been coming out of it now, kind of approaching it, you know, more from a normal service perspective and, you know, trying to mitigate impacts as we would have if it was more closer to normal service. And obviously the project goes full steam ahead, you know, even though ridership levels are not back to normal, you know, we assume they will be. In a project like this, you know, you can't wait until the ridership is there because there's such a lag time in planning, design, and construction. You know, I think we in the city have every confidence that the ridership will be back. I mean, these communities that are served, you know, are projected and are still projected to have growth over time, and the route was at capacity. So, you know, we're full steam ahead.
Thanks, Graham and Chris. Let me ask Cindy's second question. How are the materials removed from the demolished embankments being disposed of? Are they being recycled?
Yes, it depends on the nature of the material, but where we can recycle them, where it's clean, it's recycled. Where it's not, it's treated as waste and handled appropriately. But yeah, there's definitely opportunity for recycling on a project of this size. Most of it gets ended up, you know, if it's clean, if it's concrete, it ends up getting and it's clean, it ends up getting recycled, broken down and recycled.
Okay.
Some steel does as well, depending, ties generally not.
Let me go to a question from one of our students who's online, Divyakant Telyan. He asks, are there any future plans to tackle the Sheridan Red Line station by a major curvature there?
Well, that's an interesting question on the curvature. That's different from the station. Sheridan is one of our oldest pieces of infrastructure and one of the ones in desperate need of replacement. There's been a lot of thought on how to stabilize it and how to replace it in future phases of RPM. So I would say yes, it will be subject to replacement, and those curves in that area will be will ultimately change. The degree to which they will change is sort of dependent on the amount of land that we would take, and I think in general we're not taking as much as you would optimally want us to as a rider. But if you're living in the area, your interests might be different, or if there is a historical context that we want to preserve. So, when we originally started doing this project, we had a lot more takings. We were sort of assuming a more standard modern transit footprint. And when we just sort of really assessed what we could get away with, or what we could not get away with, what we could still maintain the tracks, since we could still do the work we needed to do, we weren't improving our ability to access various areas, but we were sort of maintaining kind of what we had. That enabled us to reduce the footprint and the takings of property around us, which I think at the end of the day is better for the community. We need access in some places, and if we don't get it, we're going to be, we'll have to close streets to build stuff for sometimes extended periods of time. But in the case of those curves, I would guess that there will be changes to the configuration and the speed, but they'll be pretty minor. But the station will be new. May not be in the same exact place, but we'll work through those details as we get closer.
Thank you. There's a question that came in about we're recording. We do, with appropriate permissions and our ability to get this posted on the website, we plan to do that. And when we do, we will send out a notice to the Sandhouse listserv that it's been posted. So stay tuned. Next question comes from Tom Murtha at CMAP, and he asks an important question about that is, he said many of the existing structures on the RPM have low vertical underclearances. In Illinois, a truck may legally be up to 13 feet 6 inches, but many of the existing structures underclearances are often less than 13. Will at least some underclearances be increased to 13, allow for a 13.6 clearance?
I think they all will comply with ultimate IDOT requirements for the various streets that they serve. So the answer to that is yes. That's both improving clearance for trucks is kind of key to economic development for the areas as a whole and around the infrastructure. But it's also key for pedestrians to get better sight lines, feel safer as they're walking through these stations. There's no columns in the middle of the street any longer. Clearances are better, sight lines are better, lighting is better. So it does have an impact to the commercial life of the community in terms of being able to get trucks in there efficiently to make deliveries. But it also improves the pedestrian life of the community in terms of those sight lines, lighting, and overall pedestrian safety in a clearer, better bridge.
All right, we're getting close to 1:30, so I'm going to try to get to a couple more questions here. From Walter Keevil, how will snow be removed from the flyover? It seems to be a closed structure.
Well, Walter, I did spend a lot of time, we spent a lot of time as a team thinking about drainage, I'll tell you that, which is, I know that's not strictly speaking your question, it would be snow. And as you know better than anyone, the first tool in removing snow from right of way is actually the rail cars in service. Having a good, plow on the front of those trains is the first step, and then running reasonable headways, even if you're in the middle of the overnight. We are in the process of replacing the heavy snow equipment that we have out there. I did have the honor of running one of the big snow fighters this past winter up there when we had one of the tracks closed, and then we weren't using it for a while. Track 1, we had a bunch of snow buildup, and we ultimately, as we got done with that extended closure, we had to get the big snow fighters up there and push snow off. Thankfully, I did it in the middle of the night, so we didn't screw up any of the streets. We did throw a little snow on some of the balconies. I apologize if any of you guys your balconies got dumped on. But yeah, so Walter, a combination of existing trains running on, tighter headways if we need to on the overnight of a snow system, a snow event, in combination with potentially running newer snow fighters up there that have a little bit different capacity than some of the older ones. The older ones were great machines, but they were a little crude in how they wear and how they dump snow. So I think the new ones are a little more sophisticated in terms of how they handle that load relative to the community around them. But, the closed deck has got a ton of advantages. This is one place where there isn't as much of an advantage, and that creates, in fact, a liability in terms of snow removal. But CTA's got a pretty good history of doing this, and a lot of the equipment that you and others developed at CTA are still integral to the effort.
Chris, am I mistaken, or is there heat tape along the bypass track to help with snow melt and icing?
Yeah, at various points. I mean, I think the heat tape over time has proven less effective in certain circumstances. It is. What's really probably more effective is applying paste from some of the revenue trains that are so equipped, and putting it on the third rail to prevent ice, and then the sleet scrapers that run. I mean, really, the best piece of snow fighting equipment you have is a revenue train. Undoubtedly, modifying that revenue train in an intelligent and incremental way, honoring kind of the history of how it's been done at the CTA. As I've looked at other snow events in other places, particularly Boston, it's amazing how many excuses people have to not put, small kind of cow catchers or a Fabrica plows on the front of their trains. And I don't understand why, because the best piece of snow fighting equipment you could possibly have is your revenue train running every 4 minutes. By far and away. That and a good snow fighter, a handful of them as distributed throughout the system for ballasted and closed tracks. It's just a simple formula. I don't know why every northern, Toronto's got it. Metro does a good job with it. CTA does a good job with it. Others have struggled.
I have one more question, then I'm going to turn it over to Norm. Arnold Kasem-Sarn asks, will the existing flat crossing at Clark's Junction still be used for non-rush brown line trains?
I'm going to give that one to you, Graham.
So there will still be a flat junction at Clark, and it will still be possible if the bypass were closed for maintenance or for some other reason. If you wanted to route a northbound brown line train from track 4 at Belmont Station onto the branch through the junction, you will still be able to do it. The exact configuration of the switches and turnouts is actually going to be a little different. So that movement will be slightly less efficient than it is now. But the reason for that is the old northbound track will continue to exist in the finished condition. But what it will be modified to be used for is a storage track. It'll essentially function as an extra place, a siding to use for, either putting, a bad order train, off the main line, maybe to stage equipment for a special event. And so the switches are configured a little bit differently to facilitate, putting a train stage there, in and out of that track. But if you wanted to use it for revenue service, you still could.
I will say I tried really hard to simplify the infrastructure that we had to maintain in the footprint of this project, and was not a big fan of leaving a lot of interlockings out there. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, two folks who had a huge impact on this project, Dave Kowalski and John Bloom, felt differently. And as we worked through some of the compromises and discussions that Graham talked about in his first section of presentation, where we worked through how to do the impacts, the track access occurrences, the configuration of the tracks, I had to recognize their experience and judgment on it, and honor their knowledge of the system. And so we did end up with with more infrastructure, more interlockings coming out of this project than we did going in. I don't see how that's possible in this area, but we did.
My apologies, we're not going to get to a few remaining questions, but I'd like to pass the baton back to Norm Carlson.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you, Chris and Graham, for an outstanding presentation. We hope that you'll accept our invitation to come back in the future as more progress is done out there. This is a very exciting project. And